All right, got that set up. All right, got that set up. And you're going to turn that on mute. Otherwise, I'm going to get an echo of myself.
No, I'm here also.
No. I mean, the
Don't
YouTube
be so
was.
melodramatic.
I was monitoring the YouTube chat, but it also plays and got the echo going between the two the mics and the speaker.
Okay.
All right, we'll give it a minute for other people to log in, and then we will get down to work.
Yeah. So what's the problem with internet that you have?
Well, I don't want to disparage a company too much on online, but we've been trying to do well, not trying, for 2 years, we've had a wireless router into the house, and it just keeps getting more and more unsteady. And I was talking with them last week, and they basically admitted that they oversold, can no longer service the area at the price that they set for it. And they're basically just throttling everything down and making it unstable until people leave and come back in under a worse bargain with the same company. And I said,
wow, nice.
No. I said,
Which
no, I'm going to a
company
different company then. So yeah, it's going to take until tomorrow. Hopefully the installation will happen, and then I'll be able to be on a different company that'll, God willing, by all the numbers, look more reliable. And as I said to them, he said, when you decided this, why didn't you notify the customer that this was your change? So they've given me a little bit of a refund, but not nearly what it's cost me in terms of lost productivity and just providers.
Okay.
Not a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I'm still with them tonight. So yes, heads up for everyone, just like last week. If it cuts out, chances are it'll take too long for me to get the connection back to continue tonight. So just go ahead and assume that it's dead if I drop. And that means we do need to start on chapter 2, Mishnah 2 at the end, because that's where it cut out last time. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get rolling so that we can get as much studying in before it drops. If it drops, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so we're going to run through the first half of Mishnah 2 just to get the basic structure down, but we went over this last week, so you can always review that for a more thorough discussion. If a mikvah was measured and found lacking, meaning in its prescribed quantity, all things which have been purified in it, whether a private domain or in a public domain, are accounted unclean retroactively. Like we talked about, there's normally a differentiation for issues of purity, or rather impurity, between private and public, with public being more lenient than private. But here it is not about a question of whether or not something was impure or not. It was impure, and they are going to stay impure despite having been cleaned because of this doubt. However, that only applies to what this translation is rendering as serious uncleanness, things that are from a top level impurity, or indeed from impurity that is definitely deoraita, that is from Torah. Whereas impurities that are from rabbinic prohibitions, that is covered in the second part. But in the case of lesser uncleanness, meaning of rabbinic origin, for instance, if he ate unclean food or drank unclean liquids, or if his head and the greater part of his body entered into drawn water, or if 3 loaves of drawn water fell on his head and the greater part of his body, and he then went down to immerse himself, and he is in doubt whether he immersed himself or not, or even if he did immerse himself, there is still a doubt whether the mikveh contained 40 seyas or not, or if there were 2 mikvahs, one containing 40 seyas and the other and not the other, and he immersed himself in one of them but does not know which of them, then he immersed himself. In such a doubt, he is accounted clean. So those are a repeat of our earlier list of doubts, missing the last one, but it is still the same rule, which is if it is for a non-Torah level of impurity that he is cleaning himself from, then since he did something, even if it was unclear whether he did it perfectly right, then the rabbis are willing to say that that level of purification was fine for that level of impurity. It is only for the level of Torah impurity that they are going to be retroactively saying that we have to go back and redo it for those cases. Good? That's I believe, where we were dropping last week. Now, Rabbi Yossi considers him unclean. For Rabbi Yossi says, anything which is presumed to be unclean always remains in the condition of unfitness until it is known that it has become clean. But if there is a doubt whether a person became unclean or caused uncleanness, it is to be accounted clean. So Rabbi Yossi is being consistent or strict, depending upon how you want to characterize him, and saying, look, the general rule is the general rule, what's called a chazakah, that if there is a presumption that something remains in its condition, unless there is certainty that it has had that condition changed. If you were presumed to be unclean before you went in, if you're not sure that it went right, you're going to be presumed unclean when you come out. That's just the way we handle these things. And we're not making any allowances for rabbinic versus Torah level of uncleanness. We're just going to make this across the board. Now, yes, Rabbi Yossi does lose this argument, and we follow the general statement from the earlier part of Mishnah 2. But it's just important to remember that whenever a counter-argument is advanced, there's a very good chance that it will be a reasonable position. The rabbis weren't dummies, and nobody was advancing a position that was ludicrous or just, downright crazy. They were all reasonable positions. Some simply have either better attribution to a Torah underlying concept. Some may be more consistent with general rabbinic practice, or some may simply be the majority of the practice, the custom, and as such, they win by simple majority rules in different cases. So we should never be surprised that the second or third voice on a topic is reasonable. Reasonable people can disagree in reasonable ways, but at the end of the day, the community does need to share a single standard. All right. So Mishnah 3 of chapter 2 is going to bring up this concept again about drawn water. Now, this shvuin, mayim shvuin, this water that has been drawn, we will talk about more in other places, but we need to do just a little bit of introduction first. So we have been talking mostly about water that is just straight from shamayim, or from the ocean or a spring itself. That is to say, water from rain or water from a stream, a lake, an ocean, things that are natural sources of water. In Jewish law, when it comes to the mikvah, there is a question about what happens when the water has been drawn out from that pure source and transferred to a new location. And the question becomes, well, do we know that the process was pure? Is this still a mayim chayim analog? Is this still water we can trust? And the rabbi settled with the idea that once the water has been drawn, give or take with a few little exceptions that we will eventually cover, that it is no longer kosher for the making of a mikvah. So mayim shvuim, this drawn water, now can render a mikvah not kosher, but only under certain circumstances. Again, just as a little bit of a foretaste, once you have a kosher mikvah, if you add this drawn water into it, it does not make the mikvah unkosher. But if you start with this water and then add the proper water from a natural source, that mikvah will never be kosher until drained and you start all over again. So it's a little complicated, and it's not like, a kosher versus non-kosher thing in food, where, if you add the bacon first, it's not kosher, but if you add the bacon last, it is. And it doesn't work like that, because that would be crazy. This is about founding the mikveh itself. Now, again, a little bit more of the backstory. That's because it is a rabbinic barrier, a rabbinic fence, that this drawn water not be allowed to make an artificial mikvah. Everybody agrees that the Torah is very clear, and there's no doubt that if you gather water into a independent vessel, think like, an old time bathtub sitting up on its feet, or a big bucket or something like that, and you take your bath in that is definitely not a mikvah in any way that the Torah understands. But the rabbis understand that the Torah could mean that a mikvah built into the ground, and like basically an artificial pond, that was then filled with drawn water, the Torah could mean that that's okay. Now, the rabbis are uncomfortable with that, primarily because of the idea of having the artificial, completely bucket style of a mikvah, and so they refuse to allow this mayim shvuim, this drawn water, to be used at all for the making of a mikvah. But because it's technically not against the Torah to use that type of water, that's why they allow it when you are adding to a kosher mikvah at the other end. So is that relatively clear to start? I mean, because we're going to go over it in more detail, obviously, throughout the rest of the Masechet, but I want to get at least a little bit of the background here of this drawn water issue. Yes, sir.
What is
I was going to say, I thought any water could be added to a mikvah with 40 more selas and still have it be kosher.
Well, yes, I mean, but that's the point of drawn water. Drawn water is the for the rabbis, the inferior version. It's not the spring water. It's not the naturally running water. It's not the rainwater that's just sluicing into the basin. This is, I'm literally loading up my buckets with the intention of dragging the water and using it to fill this bath. And the rabbis are saying even that water, which we would never use because of our precautions to start a mikvah, can be added to create a larger mikvah than the minimum 40, once that minimum 40 is already there.
So, Robert, I thought you could drag it as long as you didn't actually lift the water off the ground.
So we're going to get into some of the details of dragging and tipping and breaking, as you'll see. So let's hold off on some of those details. I was using dragging in the schlepping sense of Jewish conversation, not as a technical mode of transportation. Natan, did you have something else?
I didn't get it. So what is drawn water exactly?
Okay, so the classic fairy tale village where there's a well and you have a bucket. And you put the bucket on the rope down into the well, and then you pull it up, and now you've got a bucket full of water.
Yeah.
That's drawn water.
Okay.
You're drawing from the well. That's the English term for it.
Okay.
The mayim shvuim is the Hebrew for it. But since I don't know that word from any other context other than this particular topic, I'm not sure how helpful that is for you. So the drawn water is water that has been roughly put artificially taken from a water source and then transferred to a new place with that intention. That's sort of a rough definition.
So they say that if you transfer part of the water from a mikveh or to a new one, but is less than the 40, and you complete it with wrong water, it's not kosher.
Correct. So yes, you've dug a pit and you want to make it into a mikveh. You can't just go to the well and draw up a bunch of buckets and then dump it into the pit. You have to let the rain fill the pit. Or as we'll see, there are some other other options, but the classic would be to let the rain fill it.
Or on a river, no? It's
Well,
not
a river could
natural
also
water.
work if you can find a way to divert the water from the river, but you can't go to the river with a bucket, and you can't go to the river, generally speaking. And again, we're going to look at a lot of options on this, but basically, you can't just like put a pipe into the river and then have the river water come. There are some options on that, and like I said, it's complicated. That's why there's more than one chapter in this Mishnah. But the basic issue is a mikvah cannot be created with artificially gathered water. It can be added to with that same water, but not created. So that's why once you've had your pit filled with rainwater, let's just use the classic example. If you want to make it bigger, you can dump extra buckets of water in once you reach that minimum of 40 seahs. And that way, as the mikveh continues to evaporate and the water leaves, you don't have to start all over again with waiting for the rain. You can dump buckets of water into it every day and keep it going forever. Once it's made a kosher mikveh, you can maintain it using all of the extra drawn water that you want.
Okay, so after that is already a kosher, they arrive the 40 amot, you can continue all the time, bringing
Yes.
more, what's the name of this? Drawn water without problem.
Exactly.
And Rabbi,
Yes.
there's nothing against putting a chlorine or vacuum in a mikveh, is there?
No. Once you have a kosher mikveh, the whole point of being a kosher mikveh is nothing you put into it can change the sanctity of the mikveh. Now, we could argue that a mikveh that has many other chemicals or things put into it that make the water unpleasant becomes that mayim mukim, that water that's been struck, that's bad. It's still a kosher mikveh for purity, but you probably don't want to drink too much from it. But I think we could get into a discussion about its status for the modern world, where chlorinated water, when done properly, is in fact going to be the best kind of water for a person because it's going to have the fewest impurities and other kinds of, bacteria and things in it. But that's for when we get to our discussion about a modern mikveh. Okay, so with that background in mind, with the basic definition of drawn water, let's get a little complicated. Come on, there we go. The case of a doubt about drawn water, which the sages have declared clean. If there is a doubt whether 3 logs of drawn water fell into the mikveh or not, that is to say, category number 1 of maybe this is a problem, and maybe 3 logs went in, maybe 3 logs didn't. Trying to remember exactly how big a log was again. A rivi'i is a quarter of a log, which is about 100 milliliters. And then, so you get 4 of those in a log. So we're talking about a liter worth of water here. So that when we say a log, think of about a liter. Sorry, when we say 3 logs, think about a liter worth of water. If there is doubt whether 3 logs of drawn water fell into the mikveh or not, case 1. Case 2, or if they did fall in, there is doubt whether the mikveh contained 40 seahs or not. Maybe it was already at the minimum threshold, maybe it wasn't, I'm not sure. And 3, or if there were 2 mikvahs, one of which contained 40 seahs and the other did not, and drawn water fell into one of them, and it is not known into which one of them it fell, in such a doubt it is accounted clean, because there exists a possibility on which we may depend, meaning in declaring it clean. So we have these 3 cases of oops, we dumped some drawn water into the mikveh. Maybe we thought it was ready, but it wasn't for whatever reason. And when I finished dumping the water in, I'm like, wait, how much did I put in? Did I put 3 loaves or less than 3 loaves into the water?
That's water the dump there is after or before having the 40 amot?
This would be before.
Before.
This has to be before. because otherwise there wouldn't be a concern.
Okay.
Which is why we get to what's titled here, paragraph 3, the second case of doubt. I definitely put water in, and it was definitely more than 3 loaves, but maybe the mikvah already had 40 seahs before I dumped the water in which case it's fine. Or maybe it was still under 40 seahs, in which case it's a problem. So the first one, I'm doubting how much water I dumped. The second one, I'm doubting how much water was already there. And then our third case is, I don't know which one I dumped it into. One mikvah was definitely kosher, and putting the water in that was fine. And the other mikvah was definitely not ready. It was under 40 seahs, and if I dumped it into that one, then it's a problem. Well, in any of those 3 cases, if it's just this doubt of I'm not sure which I did, since one of the alternatives was always fine in each of these options, maybe it was more than 3 loaves, maybe it wasn't, maybe the mikvah that I dumped it in was lower, maybe it wasn't, or maybe I put it in a completely different mikvah than I thought, which was fine, or maybe I didn't. Because there is always a kosher option, then it is okay. We're going to be lenient on that and say, we're going to treat that as though the mikvah has not been ruined. The mikvah is presumed to still be a kosher mikvah, and any use of it is considered to be a kosher use. Yes, Aaron.
So I know we brought this up last week, but again, why are we going lenient? And does it doesn't seem to have anything to do with if it's rabbinic law or Torah law.
Well, remember, this is a rabbinic issue. The idea that the drawn water would be a problem at all is considered to be a rabbinic stringency.
All right.
So the fact that the rabbis are willing to be lenient about that drawn water fits absolutely with the idea that since it's a rabbinic prohibition, being lenient upon it is okay. As long as, again, notice the leniency is not, oh, it's fine no matter what, as long as one of the options of what happened might have been okay, which is, let me do paragraph number 6 here, and we'll see the opposite. If they both contained less than 40 seahs and drawn water fell into one of them, and it is not known into which one of them it fell, in such a doubt it is accounted unclean, because there exists no possibility on which we may depend in declaring it clean. So if you had 2 mikvahs, like paragraph number 5, and both of them were less than 40 seahs, and the drawn water fell into definitely one of them, then I know rabbinically one of them is now not kosher. And since I know one of them is definitely not kosher, but I don't know which one, then I don't have the option to say, well, it's okay if it went into one, but not okay the other. It's not okay if it went into either, which means both of them are potentially problematic, and thus we rule stringently. So it's not quite as simple to just say it's always lenient. Even in this case of a rabbinic precaution, if there's no possible wiggle room, like this last paragraph number 6 issue, then I just have to rule stringently and say, drain the 2 mikvahs, dry them out, and we start again with Maim Chaim, with the proper water. Make sense?
Yep, makes sense.
Okay. Mishnah number 4. Rabbi Eliezer says, a quarter log of drawn water in the beginning makes the mikvah invalid, and 3 logs on the surface of the water. So Rabbi Eliezer says, look, if you've got a dry mikvah, right? You've dug it into the ground, you have your mikvah ready to go, and someone puts in just a rivi'i, just this tiny little amount, like 100 milliliters, into that mikvah, then sorry, dry it off, start again, right? That's already not kosher. But once it's going, then if someone adds in 3 logs before it's reached its 40 seah minimum, then yes, we've got a problem, but it has to be 3 logs, which is, like we said, 12 times larger than the rivi'i, the quarter log of drawn water. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying, when you start the mikveh, you have to be very, very careful. And once it's going, there's a little bit more wiggle room. And then obviously once it's past 40 seyas, then no limit at all. But the sages, the Chachamim, the majority view says, both in the beginning and at the end, the measure, which makes the mikveh invalid, is 3 logs. The sages say it doesn't matter beginning or end. The precaution that we're putting here is the same measure at either part of the mikveh's creation. Whether it's the first drop or the last drop, if it's 3 logs or more, the mikveh is not kosher. But a rivi'i at the beginning doesn't have any special status. And yes, the rabbis win in that argument. All right, Mishnah number 5. So as he points out, we're going to have to do a little visualization here. And I'm going to read Dr. Kolp's version, and then I'm going to try and add a little extra color to it. So picture a hole in the ground that is to be used for a mikveh. So you've got a hole going down into the ground. There's currently no water in the hole, right? That main mikveh is completely empty, but there are 3 cavities adjacent to the hole. There are 3 cutouts. Imagine like the slope going down for one side of the mikveh. And in that slope, there are like 3 pipes that go straight down. So they're separate from the main part of the mikveh, but they are also connected to the wall of the mikveh. And eventually the water will reach the level where it connects to that pipe, right? To that hole that's along the wall of the mikveh. But if you think of it as being vertical holes, it'll be better, because if it was on the side, then the water would just drain out. Okay? So we've got our mikveh, and it's this slanted basin, and we've got these 3 holes, pipes for the moment, that are on the side. It's not really a pipe, that's a technical term, but just for the moment, I'll just keep calling them pipes because it's easier than calling them holes. And in each of those, there is just one log of drawn water. Okay, so what's going to be the issue? Well, as the mikveh is filled, will it hit the last of the 3 logs of drawn water and become invalid or not invalid? It's definitely going to hit 1 and 2 as it's rising, but the question is going to be, will it hit 40 before or after it hits that final mixture of that 3rd log? Okay, by the way, don't make your mikveh like this, but that's an argument for the architect. If there were 3 cavities in a mikveh, each holding a log of drawn water, if it is known that 40 seyas of valid water fell in before reaching the 3rd cavity, such a mikveh is valid. Otherwise, it is invalid. So now that we've got our picture down, it's pretty logical, which is to say that as the water is going up, if the main body of water doesn't reach that final collection before it has already reached the level of being 40 seyas of total water, then it doesn't matter when it reaches that final selection. It's all good. On the other hand, if it's only at 39 seyas and it hits that 3rd pipe with that last log, sorry, drain the whole thing, start all over again. The mikveh is not kosher. Now, why does this need to be said? Well, because those pipes, those other gathers, look like they are built into the mikveh. And so that seems like they're already part of the mikveh, even though the water hasn't touched. And what the Mishnah is telling us is that no, the touching of the water matters. Just having a bunch of water in separate compartments as part of the mikveh doesn't count as being in the same mix. They need to actually touch. The water has to touch. Yes, Aaron.
Why does the water in the cavities count as drawn water?
Well, the assumption is that somebody poured the water into those cavities, that it was a deliberate act, not that it was rainwater that dripped into them, but that somebody actually poured each of those 3 cavities. And again, this is not saying that this would be a common activity. or even an accidental activity, the chances are that the rabbis are using this example not because it was a real worry, but because it teaches us something about the cohesiveness of the water, that the water has to actually touch before it's counted as being joined. That seems to be their main point. Now, Rabbi Shimon tries to draw a parallel from that. Oh, go ahead.
But isn't the presumption that somebody put the water into those cavities, isn't that a stringency that was inconsistent with this being rabbinic law?
The assumption would make that inconsistent? How so?
Well, because the fact that there's a presumption, the presumption goes against leniency. It's a stringent presumption. Like before, when there was doubt, the doubt was done in favor of leniency. Now the doubt is being done in favor of stringency, namely assuming the water in the cavities was poured in.
Well, no, there's no doubt about whether the water in the cavities was poured or not. The mikveh calls it a log of drawn water, not perhaps a log of drawn water. So there's no doubt about the status of the water in the cavity. It is definitely a log, and it is definitely drawn. So that's the assumption of let's call it a thought experiment, because that's probably what it really was. So there's no room for leniency on a doubt, because there is no doubt in this particular Mishnah. This Mishnah has all the variables filled in. We know how many cavities, we know how much water is in each, and we know where that water came from. The only question is how much water is in the main part of the mikveh before it reaches that third in elevation cavity. And that's something, again, it does not seem to be in this case a doubt. We can either know that it was 40 or more, or know that it was less than 40, and thus the ruling is valid or invalid. Kasher or pasul. That's the doubt is removed from this particular Mishnah. And then Rabbi Shimon goes on to say that he declares it valid, which again is agreeing with everyone else. But he says that it's valid because it resembles a mikveh adjoining another mikveh. That this drawn water is not a problem because it is near to it. And again, he's answering that question of, well, maybe because it's part of the overall structure, it counts as being in it, even if it's not connected to the water. And he's saying, no, it's like it's next to it. And a mikveh next to a mikveh that doesn't have mingling waters, each mikveh has its own status, and that means it's not a problem. Okay, Mishnah number 6. Just give me a moment here. A little pollen in my eye since it's already an early spring in Florida and there's pollen everywhere. Okay, I know I cannot complain about pollen when everyone else is dealing with snow in other parts of the world, but you complain about what's near you. Mishnah 6. If one scraped mud to the sides and then 3 logs of water were drawn out from it, meaning from the mud, the mikveh is still valid. All right, again, like I've been saying since day one when we're in this Masechet, if you think of the mikveh as being pure because it's like mountain spring water that someone's going to put in a vending machine, you've got the wrong idea. A muddy mikveh is perfectly kosher. You may not want it, and I don't blame you. But I've seen mikvahs that were man-made where you couldn't see the bottom. That's just how they were being maintained. And yeah, I can tell you, not my favorite kind of mikvah. But here we have a question not about how dirty it is or not dirty. It's fine. It would be a kosher mikvah. The only question is, does the water that is squeezed out of the mud, just because you were moving the mud, count as drawn water or not drawn water? Again, if I were to deliberately take mud from the river and squeeze it into a bucket, everybody agrees that's drawn water, not good. On the other hand, if I am digging my mikvah and I'm, scraping out all of it, and as I scrape, of course, I'm pushing the dirt to one side. And if that dirt is muddy because the ground itself is just moist, well, the moisture in the ground isn't a problem. But does my digging count as drawing the water? And the answer here is no, that the scraping of the mud to one side as I'm digging out my mikvah does not count as squeezing its water out in a drawn fashion, and so the mikvah remains kosher. But if removed, comma, no, I think we got a problem here with the sentence. But if removed the mud away, okay, so if the mud were removed away and 3 loaves were drawn from it, meaning back into the mikvah, then it becomes invalid. So if you grab the mud from the bottom of the mikvah and you hoist it up, take it out of the mikvah, and as you do so, it's dripping water back down because it's mud and wet, that is not a valid mikvah anymore. If you drop 3 loaves back in, because you are pulling the water up, out, and it is now going back in. Just squeezing it to the side, no problem. Lifting it up, now we've got drawn water. Now, Rabbi Shimon is going to add a little bit of a wrinkle to this. Rabbi Shimon pronounces it valid since there was no intention to draw the water. So Rabbi Shimon wants to be very lenient and say, usually for water to be considered drawn water, we have to consider that the person was trying to draw the water. And that's going to be important in our next Mishnah. But here, the rabbis disagree that there is no way to draw the water out without it, or withdraw the mud out without the water coming out. That's what mud is. It's dirt and water mixed. And when you move mud, water will leave it. Thus, your intention is less important because of the inevitability of the seepage of the water dripping. So Rabbi Shimon loses this argument against the sages. If you've got a muddy mikveh, push it to one side. Don't try and scoop it out. Questions or comments on Mishnah 6? The time you looked like you were thinking, maybe? No, good.
I'm reading again because I try to understand what's the problem if you rush the water instead
So
to put on the
if you
side.
lift the mud out of the mikveh that you're making, then some of the moisture in that mud is going to drip back into the mikveh below you. And that moisture will now be called drawn water because you are drawing it up away from the dirt at the bottom.
Okay, I got it. Okay.
So if the hole you're digging happens to be wet, and if you were making a natural mikveh here in Florida, that's a very good chance, then you have to be very careful that you push things to the side rather than try to scoop it out if it's that wet. Because if it's wet and it's dripping back in, then that counts towards the 3 log of wet water. Yes, Aaron, of drawn water, excuse me.
Rabbi, if I remember correctly, and when we were going over chapter 1, we didn't reach this 3 loaves thing when, and granted we were talking about puddles, but they were talking about drinking out of puddles, and the water just going from your lip back down to the puddle would make it no longer pure. So how come, where does this 3 logs come in? Is it because the puddles are so small?
Yes, exactly. Once you reach the minimum measure of like the 40 sayas, it has a different standing.
Right,
So
but I thought once you reach 40 sayas, it doesn't matter how many logs drip back in. I thought the 3 logs was for less than 40.
Right, and that's where we are here. We're at that making of the mikvah moment. So if you are making a mikvah, you cannot use drawn water. And if you use drawn water, it's no longer considered to be a proper mikvah. And if we were talking about the drinking puddle, there we're not talking about its status as a mikvah. We're talking about its status as being ritually pure, which is a different condition altogether. Remember the drawn water and living water mikvah construction issue is, when do you reach a level of artificially constructed water containment that now has the same permanent purity status as other large natural water sources? And the puddle drinking dripping way back in chapter 1 was not about that. That was about ritual purity itself. So even if the water that you're talking about here that was dripping back in was ritually pure, that doesn't change anything. It's only about drawn versus non-drawn water.
I thought right here, though, the problem, as you were saying before, is that it's drawn water and therefore it makes it ritually impure.
A drawn water means the mikvah will not be a usable mikvah for making things ritually pure. It doesn't mean it is definitely impure. It just means it's no longer fit for making other things pure. Yeah, I know it's a bit of a head scratcher, because we usually think about like what's the purity of something. But here we're not talking about whether it is pure or not, we're talking about whether it can become ritually impure or not. And the argument the rabbis have is that 3 loaves, because it was another significant measurement taken from the temple services, that's where they derive the 3 loaves as being of minimum measure of importance, that once it has no longer come from a natural source, but has now been partially created with this unnatural source, the rabbis introduced this stringency to say that it is therefore not a kosher mikvah. But not a kosher mikvah doesn't mean it was contaminated. It just means it was created with contaminatable water. It is now prone to contamination, or susceptible. That's the best word, susceptible to contamination. Whereas our first Mishnahs in chapter 1 was about actually becoming ritually impure.
So that dripping of the water in Mishnah 1, does that count as drawn water coming from your lips back into contaminated, or it only contaminates it if the person's contaminated?
It only contaminates it if the person's contaminated. That's why that's why the status of the drinker was important.
All right, that clarifies a lot. Thanks, Rabbi.
No problem. And yes, this is, complicated stuff, partly because it's complicated just by any objective measure, and partly because it's complicated because you have both the Torah level and the rabbinic level, the precautions as well as the minimum, and then we just have the unfamiliarity with many of the ritual purity issues. Because even if we are aware of needing mikvah for X, Y, and Z and how to use a mikvah, we often are not thinking consciously as much about ritual purity as our ancestors did. And that can just make it all much more foreign to us. Even if the answers, for example, when we were in the bavas of, tort law and business law may be different than a modern American judicial system, the concepts are very familiar to us of what sort of things are we interested in, what sort of issues will come up. Whereas these issues are just ones that are not at all in our mind, and so we're starting from scratch. And that's going to be very, very evident as we hit Mishnah number 7 with its own cultural assumptions. And yeah, let's dive in. So chapter 2, Mishnah 7. If one had left wine jars on the roof to dry, and they became filled with water. Okay, here's the model. Most people back then had flat roofs. That was just the way you made your house, because you used the roof as a usable space for all sorts of different types of jobs. Kind of like, in many parts of this country, many people have basements that get used for a lot of extra odd jobs. Well, the roof was used for lots of odd jobs in ancient Israel. So you take your wine jars and you're drying them out and you put them up on the roof so they can dry out in the sun. Great idea. But while they are up in the sun, they become filled with water. All right, that's a problem. Partly because I wanted to have them dry, but what is the status of the water in them? Do they count as drawn water because they are filled with water and that is an artificial gathering of the water? Or because I put them up to dry, do they count as natural water, ma'im chayim, and I can use them for a mikvah if I can get the water from the jar to the mikvah in an acceptable means? Well, here are the opinions. Rabbi Eliezer says, if it was the season of rain, and there was in the cistern, meaning the mikvah, a little water, one may break the jars. Otherwise, one may not break them. So if he's saying, look, if there's already some rainwater, and yes, it's coming in, then you can go ahead and break the jars. They will flow down off your roof into the mikvah, and that's okay. And that'll count as still ma'im chayim rather than drawn water. It's not like you gathered them on purpose. It's not like you are deliberately putting them in into the cistern. It's very sort of roundabout. Rabbi Joshua says no. In either case, meaning whether it was rainy season or not, whether there was a little water in the mikveh or not, in either case, one may break them or tilt them, but one may not empty them into the cistern. So Rabbi Joshua disagrees and says, no, we can be very lenient about this, that if we just let the water flow from these vessels, just either tipping them out or cracking them down, that's fine. But if you pick the water up, if you pick the jar up, carry it to the mikveh, and then pour it in, now we've got a problem. Now, even though it was natural rainwater put into your jugs, once you move it in that artificial way, now now it's considered drawn water, and you cannot use it. So this accidental collection of water can be used if you do it just right, by either tipping the jars over or just breaking the jar altogether and allowing the water to resume its natural flow, if you will. Questions, comments? All right, then we'll move to 2.8, which is going to be very similar. Oh, Natan,
It's very consistent also with the issue of the hands, carrying water with the hands that we saw before. It's the same idea, the same logic.
right, it's not being lifted, it's just being allowed to move on. And in Mishnah 2.8, we're going to see something similar with a little difference. A plasterer forgot his lime tub in a cistern, and it became filled with water. Okay, so you've got somebody, and they're helping you build your mikvah, and they're doing the plaster along the walls to make sure that it's sealed, so it's not just a dirt hole. Very nice. If you go to Israel, you can go to many archaeological sites that have mikvaot, and they're all this white plaster, smooth surface if they've been preserved well. Okay, but the guy who's doing it, well, he goes off for lunch and he leaves his bucket in the mikveh. And during lunch, it starts raining and the water starts rising. It's going into the mikveh and into the bucket at the same time. So what happens? If water flowed above it a little, it may be broken. And if not, it may not be broken. The words of Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying, look, if this is my bucket, let's use my fist for the bucket, and this is the water level of the mikveh itself. If the mikveh comes up like this, and it is now connected to the bucket water, you can just break the side of the bucket, and whatever water is in it will join with the water of the mikveh, and you're not considered as being drawn water. Everything is fine. The mikveh can continue to rise. It's kosher. Everything is good. Now, Rabbi Joshua disagrees. Rabbi Joshua said, in either case, it may be broken. So he's saying, yes, I understand that you are happier if the water has already crested the bucket, and that's your leniency. But honestly, if the bucket is sitting in the mikvah and surrounded by the rest of the rainwater, then if you just crack the bucket, allow that clay to break, and then pick out the pieces, you're fine. And that would not be considered drawn water. It's just water that happened to be separated momentarily because of the way the bucket was there when the rain began. So Rabbi Joshua is more lenient on that. And in both of these cases, Rabbi Joshua wins. That this simple breakage is perfectly fine. All right. I think we've got a good shot at finishing up chapter 2 today. The internet is holding. So Mishnah 2:9. If one had arranged wine jars in a cistern and they became filled with water, even though the water of the cistern was all soaked up, they may be broken. Okay, so this is a little bit hard for us to understand because we don't use jars like this in the modern world. In the ancient world, apparently, if you had sometimes terracotta, or not ceramic, like pottery, like rough pottery, or some types of wood, if you had jars for holding wine, you would want them to be soaked in water in order to make the walls of the jar waterlogged. Apparently, and I cannot confirm this, nor can I deny this, apparently that would be a good system for then pouring wine into the jars. That because the walls had become soaked, that would then be a good thing for the jugs. Again, I have never tried to do this. I know that I have seen other people fill terracotta and then use the water that leaks out from it for other reasons. So maybe this is to try and keep it in. I'm not a pottery guy. I can only go by what the commentaries tell me about life from almost 2,000 years ago. So if you had arranged them and then they become filled with water, even though the water of the cistern was all soaked up, meaning even if like all of the water in the mikvah had been sucked through the sides of the jar and sucked way more than was ever expected. I don't know if that means you left them too long or what had happened. You can break them and the water can come out. Now, this is in sort of a modern term, more like you accidentally drop a sponge into the mikvah. If you just squeeze the sponge out underwater so that the water goes right back into the mikvah, that does not count as drawn water. Here you've got basically these clay sponges. You can break them, allowing the water to return to the mikvah, and that'll be perfectly fine. I'm guessing there's something to do with how the clay was fired or not fired properly that makes this more or less likely. Anybody who knows more about pottery, feel free to shoot me an email and explain what's going on here physically. I understand the halakha, but I don't understand the physics of the pottery. All right, and our final Mishnah for the chapter. A mikveh which contains 40 seahs of water and mud, right? So you've got the mikveh container, and at the bottom of the mikveh, there's mud, and then there's water. So it's a mixture, but you need the mud to meet your minimum 40 seahs. Meaning it's not mud plus 40 seahs on top. It's from the bottom of the mud to the top of the water, 40 seahs. Go ahead.
So right, because I was keep reading the previous one. When they say Areze Shaber, okay, he can break. What does mean? He can break Areze Shaber, meaning that you can break it only in that way to use the water only if you break it. That's what that means.
Yes, you have to break the jar, and then the water would return back into the mikvah.
Okay. Just wanted to be sure that
That's fine.
Correctly.
You know I like questions. Okay, so here we've got this mud and and water mix, Rabbi Eliezer says one may immerse objects in the water, but one may not immerse them in the mud. Rabbi Joshua says in the water and also the mud. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying, look, it's muddy water, but if there's a layer of mud at the bottom, then something that goes into the mud is not getting mikvaot. It's not being done properly. But Rabbi Joshua was saying, look, the mud is permeated by water. It's mixed. So yes, you're going into the mud, but there's still water all around you, and that's perfectly fine. And Rabbi Joshua is going to win, but we have another question. In what kind of mud may objects be immersed? Well, mud over which water floats. So Rabbi Joshua says that yes, this works, but only in the type of mud where the water actually floats. If the mud floats to the top, if it's some kind of dirt that's like scummy on the surface, and that amount is still needed, then that's a problem. But this is where the mud's at the bottom. And we're going to come back to the mud in just a second. If the water was on one side only, Rabbi Joshua agrees that objects may be immersed in the water, but may not be immersed in the mud. So if you have a muddy wall and then the rest of the mikveh, then yes, you cannot shove the plate into the muddy wall and call that purified. You have to go into the clear water, well, clearish water, and have it immersed there. And just to finish off for tonight, we get a little bit of fun. Well, what I consider fun, there we are, which is what type of mud are we talking about? What grade of mud? How muddy is the mud? Of what kind of mud have they spoken? Mud into which a reed will sink of itself, the words of Rabbi Meir, meaning that if the mud is so very, very thin and light that if you were to put just a tiny little piece of reed, it would actually sink down in it, that a piece of wood practically is heavier than the mud. That's really, really very, very thin mud. Rabbi Yehuda says, mud in which a measuring rod will not stand upright. When you're sticking your ruler in to see how deep the mikveh is, and it goes into the mud, and you let go, does it fall over, or does it stay standing straight up and down? Rabbi Yehuda says, the mud has to be watery enough that it won't hold the stick up, that the stick will fall over. It's got to be very soggy mud, loose mud. Abba Elazar ben Dulai said, mud into which a plummet will sink. So he's a little bit stricter and said, or rather more lenient, I should say, because we're talking about how thick the mud is. He is advocating a thicker level of mud, that even the heavy weight on the line that you drop to make sure you're digging or building something straight, if that will sink, that's still good enough mud. Now that's a heavy weight, certainly a lot heavier than a reed, and that means you're at another layer of firmness for the mud. Rabbi Eliezer says, such as will go down into the mouth of a jar. Even thicker, you can scoop up the mud, and if you put it on a jar, if it will collapse and go through the jar, then that's okay. And then finally we have Rabbi Shimon says, such as will enter into the tube of a water skin, which is even a smaller opening. And yet this mud, thick though it may be, will eventually get through it. Even thick mud like that, that's okay. But Rabbi Elazar ben Zadok says, such as can be measured in a log measurement. So that this is another like measuring device that as long as you can put it into the measurement for water, it's good. It doesn't matter really how thick or wet it is at all. Now, I know you're all wondering, who wins the argument? Which kind of mud at the bottom of my mikveh is still okay for me to dip my plates and cups into? Because you all want to use the muddy mikveh. Rabbi Yehuda wins the argument. that if your measuring stick will not stand up, then that mud is okay. That is loose mud, perfectly fine. It's got enough water in it. Go ahead and use it. The other standards, Rabbi Abba Elazar, Eliezer, etc., all of the firmer mud, no. You can stand on that mud, but you cannot push things into it to have them become ritually pure. So we finished with our discussion of different types of mud, something I'm sure that you were not planning on today, but that's the joys of study. You never know where it's going to take you. Any questions or comments? All right, then we'll finish on the mud note. Hopefully my internet will be even better next week, and I will see you all then.
So the mud need to be very liquid.
The mud needs to be pretty liquidy. If you can stick something in it and it stands up, that's too solid. And if you've ever been in like a lake with very, very loose mud, you know that feeling where it feels like water. Your leg just goes right through it. That's why it's always better to jump off the dock if you're in a lake rather than walk in from the side.
Thank you so much, Robbie.
Take care, everyone. Good night.
Bye.